In today's episode, we're going to be playing with variable geometry turbos. And by that, I mean we're going to take a giant VGT from a diesel truck and stick it on a tiny Honda engine and see if we can use it to reduce turbo lag. Will the VGT work on an engine with less than half the displacement of the diesel engine it came off of? Will it reduce lag? Or will it fail and flush all my hopes and dreams down the crapper? Let's find out. But before we do, can we just talk about turbos? Just for a little bit. I'm not some professional tuner or builder or whatever, but what I've come to understand is that small turbos are responsive, but can't make a ton of power. And big turbos can make bigger power, but are laggy and less responsive. Let's take a look at my daily driver, a WRX swapped 99 Legacy wagon. This has the stock TD04, and that's the same little turbo that's on most older WRXs, and this thing loves to spool. If you're punching it at anything like 3,000 RPM or above, it's gonna be party time. Problem is, it's basically maxed out, right? Like sure, it spools fast, which is a ton of fun, but the peak power this thing can push isn't very high, and it falls off in the top end. For a daily driver like this, that's fine. But what if you wanted more power? Well, you'd probably need a bigger turbo. Here's an HX40 on my buddy's DSM. Again, another 4-banger turbo setup, just like the Subaru. However, this turbo is substantially bigger. And because of its size, this thing doesn't start to make real boost until like 6,000 RPM. But when it does, oh boy does she sing. When it's actually spooled up, it's not messing around. So, going by these examples, if you wanted bigger power, you'd want a bigger turbo, right? But at what cost? Lag. Lag is usually the cost. So, what exactly is turbo lag? It can mean a bunch of different things, but there are two categories of lag I want to focus on in this video. The first is minimum RPM. This is basically when the engine is at a lower RPM and it isn't able to spool the turbo. When it isn't able to kickstart that classic turbo cycle that we all know and love. You can floor it all you want, but the turbo won't spool. When the engine starts climbing in RPM, it also starts creating more exhaust air. And eventually we create enough exhaust flow to spool the turbo up, starting our self-powering turbo cycle. But the question still remains. What is the lowest RPM we need to light that cycle off? In the case of this Legacy with its tiny stock turbo, it's around 3,500 RPM or so. So this thing comes on early. This is in stark contrast to this DSM with its HX40, which really only comes on around like 6,000 RPM. And that's a real kick in the jewels, especially considering this car redlines at $8,000. We've only got 2,000 RPM to play. But man, those 2,000 RPMs are a riot. The Legacy redlines at 7,500 RPM. So if boost hits around 3,500, that means we've got 4,000 RPM to play. 4,000 is bigger than 2,000, so it must be better, right? Not exactly. Sure, the boost comes on early, but that smaller turbo just can't push the kind of numbers that a big one does. Not to mention that the power tends to fall off in those higher revs. Remember, more RPMs equals more air. So when this thing is cranking at like $6,000, that little baby turbo is starting to become somewhat of a restriction, dampening the output power. And this is noticeable when doing full throttle pulls. That being said, this is a daily driver, and having a small responsive turbo is nice for just cruising around and traffic surfing. So, that's our minimum RPM lag. But there's still the second type of lag, that transient turbo lag. So, assuming we're well above our minimum RPM, how fast does the turbo spool up? So say we're at something like $6,000, we're really up there, and we're coasting off throttle. When I stomp it, how long does the turbo take to spool up again? In the case of the small turbo and the Leggy, it's quick, like a second or so quick. It's a tiny turbo, so we don't need much flow through the exhaust side, and the actual spinny bits are really small, so they're pretty lightweight, so they start spinning pretty easily. Now, this is in stark contrast to the larger HX40, which has a much bigger exhaust side. So it needs much more exhaust to start up, and the turbo wheels are much bigger and heavier, so they take more time to get moving. All right, that's our two types of turbo lag, minimum RPM, which is the RPM you need to be above to start making good boost, and transient lag, which is how long it takes to spool when you come back on throttle in the higher RPMs. All in all, I think we can sum things up like this. Big turbo equals big lag, and small turbo equals small lag. But big turbo equals big power, and small turbo equals small power. You just can't have both. Or can you? There are some pretty creative ways out there to assist with lag reduction, things like anti-lag and no lift to shift. I've seen twin turbo setups and something like a sequential setup with valves and such, and I've seen some cars use a quick shot of NOS to light things off earlier too. But what if there was another option? What if we could instead somehow resize the turbo live while the engine is screaming in the middle of a pull? Finally, here we are, the actual topic of this video. This is my K-swapped RX-8. And here's the star of the show, a variable geometry turbo. More specifically, it's an HE300VG for a 2013 through 2018 Dodge Cummins 6.7 liter. Or at least it would be if it wasn't a knockoff that I got on eBay. A name brand whole set unit costs more than this engine and trans combined, so we're working with what we got here. So VGTs aren't new technology by any means. They've been common in diesel trucks for some time now, and there's a number of good videos out there that break them down better than I can. But the short version is that they basically allow you to adjust the airflow on the exhaust side of the turbo to achieve better response at different RPMs, amongst other things. Some use individual vanes, such as this setup that directs the exhaust flow to the turbine wheel, but the one that I'm using uses a ring of vanes to adjust the airflow. The best way I found to describe this setup is that it's like putting your thumb over the end of a garden hose. Without your thumb there, the water velocity is pretty slow. But when you restrict the flow, the velocity increases. Something similar is happening here in the VGT, where that higher velocity exhaust air is directed to the turbine wheel. And when I found out about these turbos, I knew what I had to do. Slap it on a tiny four-banger and see if we can reduce lag. But, in case you haven't noticed, this Honda engine isn't a 6.7 liter diesel engine. It's a 2.4 liter gas engine. It is substantially smaller. It has less than half the displacement of the engine this turbo was meant for, so this turbo would normally have a ton of lag on this little engine, just like the turbo on this DSM. It also has a big turbo that originally came off of a big diesel engine. We just slapped it on a smaller displacement four-banger, and yeah, it lags. A lot. The difference being, of course, that my turbo here has those VGT bits. I chose this specific turbo because it uses an electronic actuator to adjust the vane position. It only has 4 wires, 12 volt, ground, and the CAN bus twisted pair. I found some info on the CAN bus messages that this turbo uses for control and made an adapter board to control the VGT from my standalone ECU. I can also override the ECU and manually control the VGT from an app that I wrote, and we'll be using that to do some fancy experiments. And we'll actually start right there with some high-level testing. Now, first things first, we have a big turbo on a small engine. Normally, we would expect this turbo to lag, so that's what we're going to test first. I'm going to lock the VGT at the full open position using the app. That is to say, we're at the 0% closed position. Then, I'm going to do a pull. This pull will be our baseline, as if the turbo has no magic VGT stuff going on and was just a big old turbo. We just want to see what our worst case scenario looks like. All right, here we go. Locked open. Okay, let's take a look at the graph. As you can see, we hit target boost right around 5,500 RPM. So that's our minimum RPM lag we talked about earlier. That's pretty high, but it's what we'd expect to see with a turbo of this size on this small of an engine. The vanes are locked open, so this is basically just a normal giant turbo. I also did some driving and found that this thing is pretty sluggish to respond to the throttle, even when the RPMs are high. So both of our minimum RPM and transient lag are pretty high. And yeah, that tracks. Big turbo, small engine. So now that we've identified our baseline results, let's go ahead and lock the vanes at something like 70% closed. We'll do another poll and see how the numbers differ. This is the poll that'll determine if the VGT makes any sort of difference. So this is the one we've been waiting for. Here we go. Okay, I think this graph really speaks for itself. We do indeed hit boost earlier, right around 4,500 RPM. So, the VGT works, and all that work I put into this is justified, thank fucking God. I also noticed that this turbo is quite a bit more responsive, as in, it spools up faster when I'm above that new minimum RPM of 4,500. So, both our minimum RPM and transient lag are way improved. Now, it's not as quick as something like that little Subaru turbo, but it's certainly quicker than with the vanes fully opened, and it's really noticeable when just cruising around. But that's with the vanes locked at 70%. That means we're actually restricting our exhaust flow when we're revving the engine out. Now, since this turbo is hooked up to my standalone ECU, I can make a map that will transition the vanes from closed to opened after the turbo's been spooled up. Now, my first instinct was to make a map based on RPM, where in the low revs, the VGT would close up to help the turbo spool, and then taper it open as the RPMs climbs to help reduce that restriction. And yeah, this would work, but say I was coasting at higher RPMs off throttle. When I lean back into the throttle, the vanes would be completely open, and I wouldn't get any help with re-spooling the turbo. In other words, it wouldn't help with that transient lag. So instead, what we want the map to do is, when the boost is low, close up those vanes to help the turbo spool. And when the boost goes high, open them up to remove exhaust restriction. We want the vanes to help us build boost, regardless of what RPM we're at. In other words, when it's low, help it flow. But when it's high, let it fly. Alright, let's go ahead and pop this map in and do a poll. Okay, here's our final graph with our final boost pressure based map. We can see that the turbo still spools up nice and early, and the turbo opens back up to reduce that exhaust restriction. And there we go. That's that. With those tests done, my initial questions with this turbo have been answered. Does the VGT work on a small four-banger? Yeah, and the difference is quite noticeable. Does the VGT reduce the minimum RPM needed to build boost? Yes, the minimum RPM lag has been improved and we can build boost at a much lower RPM. Is our transients lag improved? Yes, the turbo spools up much faster when we lean back onto throttle in the higher revs. So there we go, there's our answer. However, these graphs only tell part of the story, that being when we're doing wide open throttle pulls. Where this setup really shines is in drivability. Like when I'm on the highway, just cruising around at 3,500 RPM, I can just lean into the throttle and it'll spool. So if I want to pass someone or just accelerate, I don't even have to downshift. The turbo will spool that low. Or if I'm just cruising back mountain roads, when I go up a hill, the VGT will spool the turbo up so I don't have to downshift. When I lock the vanes at 100% open, it won't do that. I can floor the thing at like $4,000 and it won't build any boost. The vanes make a massive difference. Okay, here's what I want to show you guys. The VGT is just on its normal boost-based map. We're right around 3,500. I'm gonna lean into the throttle. Watch what happens to the boost. Oh, fuck. Folks, I think I leaned into it a bit too much. Yeah, that spiked up to 14 PSI. Target boost is 16, so we didn't even cross $4,000 I didn't see. Okay. I'm gonna try the same thing again, but this time with the vanes locked at 100% open. I'm gonna floor it. Here we go. It's trying. It's basically nothing though. So, nowhere near as responsive as with the vanes. They're helping us, as you can tell. And that was at 100% throttle. Whenever we were spooling with the vanes helping us, we were only using 40, 50% probably. I wasn't looking, but that's what it felt like. So, yeah, for drivability, it really helps. Look at how low the throttle is. That's nuts. And to be honest, we got to be careful with this. Boost at lower RPMs is pretty rough on engines. The pistons aren't moving all that fast, so each individual ignition really slams the piston and rods and, well, the whole rotating assembly. And with more boost, those hits are even harder. Now, this engine has forged internals, and I don't let the boost build too high, but if you were to keep leaning into it, the turbo would keep spooling until it hit target boost. So, you know. Yeah, I just got back from filming that demo about how low the boost spools, and I'm pretty sure I murdered an entire village of bugs on the way. And you know I'm too fucking lazy to clean this thing, so that's the way it's gonna be in the background. Anyway, I did notice a few interesting side effects that the VGT has, so I'll just sort of run through them rapid fire like. Now, one thing you'll notice diesel trucks doing is a vane sweep. That's where, when the truck is just sitting there idling, you'll hear the exhaust note change and then go back to normal. That's the turbo sweeping the vanes from 0 to 100% and then back to 0. They do this to make sure the vanes don't get stuck in the idle position with carbon and gunk or whatever's in the exhaust, and the controller I built for this turbo does that as well. The ECU tells the controller when the engine's idling, so it can sweep the vanes every 30 seconds or whatever. The exhaust note changing really trips people up, which is kind of fun. Speaking of trucks, they have a feature called an exhaust brake, or a turbo brake, that they'll use when they're towing to help slow the rig down without overheating or wearing down the brake pads. Now, this is achieved by setting the VGT vanes to something like 80 to 100% closed, which increases back pressure, thus slowing the engine and the whole rig down. So the question is, can I do this on my gas engine? And the answer is, kinda. Right now, if I set this turbo to 100% closed while I'm driving, that excess back pressure, which would normally be used to slow the engine down, instead forces its way out of the wastegate. This is still just a normal turbo setup. It has a wastegate, and the wastegate is just a spring holding a valve closed. So when the back pressure builds to a high enough level, it just forces that valve open and goes out the wastegate, so the braking isn't really all that noticeable. Now, this is a 2-port wastegate, so I could probably rig it up to keep the wastegate closed, but I'm not sure what kind of effect that would have on a gas engine, and I really don't need an exhaust brake, so I haven't messed with it. So I'm sure a number of you are wondering if I'm gonna sell the controller or make a kit so you can use one of these, and the answer is no. I'm not gonna sell it because most of this is available for free on my site already. Right now I have the CAN bus messages and all that stuff on my site, along with links to the info that I referenced to program my controller. I'll also look into posting the actual controller code itself, along with the app, but I'm just not sure if there's enough interest in something like this to justify putting the time into cleaning up the code base and posting it. So drop a comment and let me know if that's something you'd like to see. Now, full disclosure, this hasn't been all sunshine and rainbows for this turbo. One day I was out for a longer drive and I could feel that the car just wasn't as responsive as I was used to it being. Like the vanes were stuck. So I checked the app and I could see that the vanes weren't able to do a full sweep from 0 to 100%. That's why I went through the trouble of making an app for this, by the way. If things go wrong, when things go wrong, you need to be able to troubleshoot, to see data and check what's actually going on. The app has a bunch of features, but the two that mattered were that number 1, I could see the current position of the vanes, and number 2, I could command a specific position that I wanted them to be at. I tried to set the vanes to 0% closed, but the turbo was only able to go to like 30%. And then I tried to set them to 100% closed, and it was really only able to go like 60%. I could shut the car off, and I could hear that the turbo actuator was trying to get past that range, like I could hear the motor whining and stuttering. But it eventually just gave up and shut the actuator down altogether, which meant there was a problem. After I tore the turbo down, I saw that the fins on the ring were deformed. It's somewhat tough to see in the photos, but those fins are kinda twisted and even a bit pitted, and I'm not quite sure why this happened. Before I committed to doing this project, I did some research, as usual. I wasn't able to find anybody who actually put one of these on a gas engine and got it to work. I only found people asking about it. Something I saw a few people mention is that gas engine EGTs are higher than diesel engines, and that the higher temps might melt down the turbo, which is maybe what we're seeing here. But I've also seen diesel guys use these on high performance builds, which I think reach higher EGTs than gas engines, so I thought it might not be a problem. Also, this is an eBay turbo. It's a knockoff. It's not a real unit. So maybe the vanes were made with crappy materials. I don't know. My fix for now was just to replace the vane ring, and the one that I replaced it with was allegedly made of better materials. And I've since then put a bunch of miles on the car, and it hasn't given me any more trouble. Which brings us to our last topic. Should you do this? And the answer is maybe, probably not, I don't know. This was a really cool project. It works, and it's fun to tinker with and turn all the knobs and that. But in this video, I only compared this turbo to itself. As in, yeah, it spools faster with the vanes working, even on a little Honda engine, and that's pretty cool. But there's a lot of turbos out there. And for how much you'd end up paying for the turbo and the controller and all the fab work to get this to fit, you might be better off with going with a more expensive turbo that's just overall a better choice. They've been working on turbo technology like it's the cure to cancer, and I've heard that there's some pretty good turbos out there that are both pretty big and still pretty responsive. So we have to ask ourselves, would one of those fancy expensive turbos be a better choice if you're looking to make power? Me personally, I have no idea. I've never had a fancy expensive turbo, so I can't really compare. All my turbos are either factory turbos from different cars and trucks, or just knockoffs straight off of eBay. And let's face it, I'm not looking to make huge power with my builds. I just want to build cool things, and yeah, a lot of times that involves making some more power. Also, for anyone who follows me, yes, I case-swapped an RX-8, and this is probably the first you're seeing of it. Surprise! So, what's next for this setup? Honestly, I'm not quite sure. Right now, I'm only pushing around 16 pounds of boost. This car has given me a good bit of trouble, so I haven't really felt comfortable turning it up until recently, and this setup is just begging for more boost. There's still a number of things I need to take care of on this car, and one of those things is the exhaust manifold. A buddy of mine and myself boogered this together so that I could experiment with this turbo, and while it works, it has cracked on me a few times. So when I go to replace it, I want to make sure that I'm actually committed to sticking with this turbo. And you probably saw that I have an exhaust back pressure sensor and a turbine speed sensor. I still need to get those wired in and working, but after that I'd love to go to the dyno and get some numbers. Maybe reproduce the graphs that I showed you in this video, but instead of showing you boost pressure curves, I'll show you horsepower curves. That'd be pretty cool. And while we're at the dyno, we can turn the boost up and dial things in. It'd be pretty cool to see how the VGT behaves at higher pressures. But if I'm gonna go that far, I should probably get a name brand turbo in there. Maybe something fancy with ball bearings and lightweight wheels and whatever. I don't know. So if there's any turbo companies watching this, drop me a line. Let's work something out. Okay, I think that about wraps it up for this video. VGTs are pretty cool, especially in a little gas engine. And I feel like I've only scratched the surface with this thing, so if you have any questions or you want to see more about it, let me know in the comments and we can do a follow-up video. I also have a Discord where I'm pretty sure we'll be chatting about this, so drop on in if you'd like. And if you like this kind of content, be sure to subscribe or whatever. I have a bunch of other videos like this one where I go over things like VTEC and tuning and all that. And I might have some more videos on the way if I'm feeling like it. Who knows? But until then, bye for now.